My name is Alireza Jafarzadeh, and I'm the Deputy Director of the NCRI's Washington office. Today, we have a distinguished panel discussing Ebrahim Raisi as he swears in to take over as the new president of the Iran regime and what the world, particularly the United States and Europe, should do in having an effective policy in dealing with Iran now that you have a mass murderer at the helm. This event is broadcast live on our website, NCRI-US.org, as well as on our Twitter account at NCRI-US. We also have many people who've joined us on Zoom from across the United States, and I want to thank them all for joining us. Journalists can pose their questions using the Q&A on Zoom or email their questions to media@ncrius.org. Let me briefly introduce our distinguished panel members. Joining me on the panel is Judge Michael Mukasey, the 81st Attorney General of the United States. Thank you so much, Judge, for attending. Sure. We also have Senator Joe Lieberman, who represented Connecticut in the United States Senate spanning 3 decades. He was also vice president nominee of the Democratic Party in the presidential elections in the year 2000. Senator, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alireza.
Sure. And joining us from London is Mr. Jeffrey Robertson, QC, a distinguished human rights barrister, academic, author, and broadcaster. He served as the first president and appeal judge in the UN War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone. He's done his own independent investigation of the 1988 massacre of thousands of political prisoners in Iran. Thank you so much, Mr. Robertson, for joining us all the way from London. But before we get to our panel, let me first introduce our new book that was released just this morning. The book title is actually Iran Call for Justice, and the case to hold Ebrahim Raisi to account for crimes against humanity. This book comes in 6 chapters and 96 pages. It elaborates on the life of Ebrahim Raisi, the regime's new president. It has an entire chapter on the 1988 massacre of some 30,000 political prisoners. The book elaborates on Raisi's role in the mass murder and the suppressing dissent. There's an entire chapter also dedicated to accountability and how the tide has now turned. The book also elaborates on how Raisi was selected as the new president, as the Supreme Leader Khamenei paved the way and cleared the field for him to assume the presidency of this repressive regime out of absolute desperation. But before I go into more details about the book, I'd like to start with our first panel member, Mr. Jeffrey Robertson, QC. Mr. Robertson, you have done your extensive investigation about the 1988 massacre. I think it would be best if you would elaborate on that, but particularly on the fatwa that was issued by Khomeini himself, which is really the foundation for the whole massacre. Yes, what is in the fatwa? Who is the target of the fatwa? You know, what role the fatwa played in the killings? You know, how it was implemented, and you know what that led to. So please use the opportunity to elaborate on this and all the other things you'd like to share with our audience about your research. Please,
sure.
Mr.
Good morning, everyone. 10 years ago, I was asked by the Boromond Foundation in Washington to report on what was then a little-known massacre in Iranian prisons in 1988. And I was able to interview over 40 survivors who had been able to witness some aspect of this atrocity. I was able to read in translation the government papers of the time, look at UN records and other unimpeachable sources. And my conclusion on overwhelming evidence was that this was the worst crime against humanity committed against prisoners since the death marches of American and Australian soldiers by Japan at the end of the Second World War. Those who ordered those death marches were convicted and punished by international tribunals in Tokyo. But those who ordered the Iranian massacres have not only been allowed impunity, but they've been risen high in the country's government. And one of them, Ebrahim Raisi, risen to the presidency. Now, his role, proved beyond any reasonable doubt, was to sentence prisoners to death without any right to trial, to be represented by a lawyer, without any right at all. He was primarily responsible for the murder of thousands of inmates. Many of them had already served their sentence. They were just being held after their time had passed. Most of the sentences had been for protesting as students or handing out pamphlets. But he was a member of the death committee, which supervised 2 waves of executions in Iranian prison. The first in July and August 1988, and this oppositionists belonging to the MEK group, and a second wave in September of men who were atheists or communists or somehow disagreed with the theological state. And women in this category were not hanged, but they were whipped until they recanted or until they died, as many did, from their whippings. Now, international crimes of this magnitude can't be forgotten or forgiven. And the very idea that a leading perpetrator might years later have in his power to the development of a nuclear weapon is truly unconscionable. Well, the prison massacres of the oppositionists were ordered by the Ayatollah Khomeini in a fatwa that he issued in fury after he'd been forced to a truce in the war with Saddam Hussein. Now, the war that Dr. Kissinger hoped that both sides would lose. And he was very angry, and he ordered in revolutionary rage and rancor that there should be immediate death for all who were Moharib, as it's called, enemies of God, i.e. enemies of the theological state that he had constructed. Raisi was not bound to act as he did. Khomeini's own deputy, an Ayatollah named Montazeri, was opposed to it, and he called Raisi in with a couple of his fellow death committee members and told them to stop, told them, and I quote, I am worried about the judgment that history will pass upon us. Well, Raisi was not worried by that judgment. He went on killing. He went on to the second wave, killing those who were apostates who didn't follow the religion of the Ayatollah Khomeini. So what actually happened? In my report, I describe the evidence in this way. In July 1988, as the war with Iraq was ending in a truculent truce, prisons in Iran, crammed with government opponents, suddenly went into lockdown. All family visits were cancelled. televisions and radios switched off. Prisoners were kept in their cells and disallowed exercise. The only permitted visitation was from a delegation, turbaned and bearded, which came in black government BMWs to the jails. A religious judge, a public prosecutor, that was Raisi, and an intelligence chief. Before them were paraded, briefly and individually, every prisoner, and there were thousands of them, who had been jailed since 1980 for adherence to the Mujahideen Khalq organization, the MEK. And the delegation had but one question for these young men and women, most of them detained merely for street protests in 1981. And upon that question, although they didn't know it, their lives would depend. Those who by their answer evinced any continuing affiliation with the MEK were blindfolded and ordered to join a conga line that led straight to the gallows. They were hung from cranes, 4 at a time, or in groups of 6 from ropes hanging from the front of the stage in an assembly hall. Some were taken to army barracks at night, directed to make their wills, and then shot by firing squad. Their bodies were doused with disinfectant, packed in refrigerated trucks, and buried by night in mass graves. Months later, their families, desperate for information about their children or their partners, would be handed a plastic bag with their few possessions. They'd be refused any information about the location of the graves and ordered never to mourn them in public. By mid-August 1988, thousands of prisoners had been killed in this manner by the state, without trial, without appeal, and utterly without mercy. Those killings were suspended for a fortnight, for a religious holiday, and then the death committee, on which Raisi was a member, started a second wave of killing, summoned those who were regarded as left-wing or had an ideology incompatible with the theocratic state. And this time, the question was not their political affiliation, but whether they were apostates. There was a brief inquiry if they were atheists or agnostics, and then if they were sent out to be hanged. The women, however, were whipped. They were whipped 5 times a day until they agreed to pray, or, of course, as many did, they died from the lash. And this second wave of executions was actually genocidal in intent because the victims were selected on religious criteria, with torture as the alternative sentence. And so that's why I concluded that this was even worse, although comparisons are invidious, than the Japanese death marches, or indeed the genocide of 7,000 Muslim men and boys at Srebrenica. So let's reach the judgment of history. How do we make it? Back in 1988, the UN Special Rapporteur, who was a naive El Salvadorian diplomat, was allowed into prison, into Iran, but with a brass band, just as the Nazis welcomed visitors to the concentration camp. But he was refused permission to interview any oppositionists or Montazeri. And at the UN, Iranian diplomats made utterly dishonest denials, and nothing was done. So this barbaric crime, which the UN did know about, thanks to Amnesty International reports, it hangs heavy, I think, on the UN's conscience. So can something now be done? Be done by America in particular, which has not always been a friend to international justice. There is a procedure authorized by 124 states of the UN for trial at the International Criminal Court. But that would first require a Security Council resolution, likely to be vetoed by Russia, if not China. Moreover, even if it isn't, the ICC is not really equipped for trials in absentia. It would have to catch Raisi first and put him on trial, and it's unlikely that he'll venture out of Iran. It's got no procedure for trial in absentia, so that would be a problem. We could, however, draw on a precedent set by George W. Bush for trials in absentia, called the Lebanon Tribunal, which has developed fairish procedures for such a trial, putting people on trial who can't be arrested. So Raisi could be referred to that tribunal or to a similar one, an ad hoc tribunal for a trial in absentia set up whether by the Security Council or more likely by the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. Well, if that can't be done, there is certainly one American initiative that should be followed in Raisi's case, and that's the Magnitsky Law, which was pioneered by John McCain, President Obama in 2012, and then the Global Magnitsky Act in 2016. And it's been used by President Trump and President Biden recently against perpetrators of human rights atrocities in Belarus and Myanmar. And the importance of Magnitsky laws, named after a prisoner who was tortured to death, really, in a Russian prison, is that last year, Britain adopted one, and so did the European Union. And there are now 31 democratic countries that have these targeted sanction laws for use against perpetrators of human rights abuses. And I have to say that there could be no individual whose name should be higher on every country's Magnitsky list than Ebrahim Raisi. Now, that targeted sanctions, of course, don't involve imprisonment. There's no physical punishment, but they do serve to name and blame the worst of perpetrators and to shame the country that elects them to any sort of high office. Raisi's name, as I say, should be at the top of every list, America's and those of other countries. And of course, that would prevent him from coming to the United Nations like Gaddafi, although he is unlikely to attend. But he is an international criminal. He should be put on trial wherever, whenever he can be apprehended. And at least his name on the targeted sanctions list would prevent his atrocities from being forgotten. Of course, I would encourage America to strive for a trial in absentia, an international proceeding that would affect him. Otherwise, the only remedy would be political. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Robertson. Really appreciate your insight, especially your experience in that. You mentioned that the fatwa and the killings were genocidal. You described it as worse than the Srebrenica. And you said that you referred to the Lebanon tribunal and so many other similar cases. And certainly you showed that there are several paths available to bring Ebrahim Raisi to justice. And but I want to use the opportunity to talk about the fatwa a little bit, as we covered that in our book, the new book for those of you who joined, the new book that we just put out today about the massacre in Iran and the role of Raisi. The fatwa that was issued sometime in July of 1988 is very specific. And I'll just read part of the first paragraph just to give you an idea. You see the handwriting on the screen. It just says, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, as the treacherous munafiqin, which is a derogatory term that the regime uses for the mujahideen khalq, as the treacherous mujahideen do not believe in Islam, and what they say is out of deception and hypocrisy, and as their leaders have confessed that they have become renegades, and as they are waging war on God, as they are tied to the world arrogance, and in light of their cowardly blows to the Islamic Republic since its inception, it is decreed that those who are imprisoned throughout the country and remain steadfast in their support for the Mujahideen, for the MEK, are waging war on God and are condemned to execution. And then it describes, who will carry out the task and name some individuals and basically the formation of the death commission. So this is very specific that the decree was issued against the MEK. And then, the Attorney General of the regime, Musawi Ardebili, basically had some doubts. And then he wrote a question to Khomeini asking like 3 questions, whether those who were sentenced to death or not sentenced to death actually, or those who had already served their term, whether they should also be included in those executions. And Khomeini responded by one word saying yes to all of those things. So removing any doubts that it's not that what they have done or what they had already been sentenced to, it's all about the loyalty, it's all about the continued commitment to the Mujahideen Khalq or the MEK that would be leading to their death. And then Ayatollah Montazeri, who was the successor designate to Khomeini, he found out about it, wrote 2 letters. The first one on July 31st and the second one on August 4th, protesting to those killings who had just started. And, since he didn't really get a positive response, he actually summoned the death commission members, including Raisi. And in that meeting, which he actually himself taped that meeting, he chastised the members of the death commission, including Ebrahim Raisi, asking them to stop the killings. And of course, when he realized that's not going anywhere, so he wrote to them. And as you can see the letter on the screen, this is a letter. On top of it, there are 4 names mentioned. One of them is Ebrahim Raisi. These are, members of the death commission. I think this document by itself is an incriminating evidence of Raisi's involvement in the death commission, as testified by Montazeri, the number 2 person in the regime. And then eventually, Montazeri himself was dismissed as a successor designate by Khomeini himself 8 months later in March of 1989. And so isn't it ironic that now after 33 years, the same killer, Raisi, emerges with the same mission to annihilate the MEK, which has been expanding over the past few years, especially since 2018. In one word, it's now the showdown between the entirety of the regime on the one side, those people who were responsible for the murder of 30,000 political prisoners in 1988, including that, and more than 90% of them were actually the members of the MEK. And then on the other side, the people of Iran, those who are involved in the protests, and on top of it, the MEK, that now that showdown is becoming very, very crystal clear with the selection of Ebrahim Raisi at the helm. So with that, I'd like to go to our second member of our panel, Judge Michael Mukasey. I know Mr. Robertson raised a number of legal issues, but I think, Mr. Mukasey, I'm sure you have your own thoughts on legal issues, but also you have a lot of things to say about the policy issues, the political aspect of things, because things are not happening in vacuum. So I leave this to you, Judge, and please go ahead and elaborate on your thoughts.
Thank you, Ali Reza. I think in some ways this is a unique event. I think it's fair to say that there's no record at any time of a meeting having been held to discuss and consider why and how a person who is being installed as president of a sovereign country, even while the meeting is ongoing, as is happening today, might be made to account before some tribunal for mass murder and other violations of human rights against the citizens of that country, acts that he participated in even before he took his current office. And this event is being held for good reason on the very day that Ebrahim Raisi is taking office as president of Iran, so as to call attention to how grotesque it is that such a person is being invested with whatever power goes with that office, and to call attention also to the cynical choice that underlies the sham election of Raisi, a choice by the current supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Khamenei, to disregard any adverse international reaction to putting Raisi in the presidency at this time. But we should not let the symbolic uniqueness of this occasion blind us to the fact that there is, as Jeffrey Robertson suggested, ample precedent in history for holding high government officials responsible for the kinds of crimes that the record shows Ebrahim Raisi participated in, particularly during the summer of 1988, but even afterward. We should also not overlook that his crimes have been known, at least in outline, for decades, and increasingly in detail as the years have passed. What are those crimes? Well, they are treated in exhaustive detail in a thorough report that was prepared by our co-panelist, Jeffrey Robertson, that was published in May of 2010 under the title, The Massacre of Political Prisoners in Iran, 1988. And I would invite anyone who wants to learn those details to consult that excellent report, published by the Boromon Foundation, unaffiliated and politically independent. Briefly, those crimes involve his having participated as one of 4 members, as we've heard, in what became known as a death committee, to carry out orders in one or more fatwas that were issued beginning in July of 1988 by the then supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, that directed the arbitrary torture and killing of thousands of prisoners, including holding some of them collectively responsible for acts that were committed when they were already in jail on other charges, and others simply for being apostates from the interpretation of Islam that was then endorsed and sanctioned by the Khomeini regime. The overwhelming majority of those tortured and executed, and as you've seen from Ali Reza's remarks, the targets of this fatwa were principally members of the MEK. This committee, in which Ebrahim Raisi participated, delivered its judgments against prisoners in proceedings that were a mockery of the concept of a trial, involving simply asking a few questions of the accused, mainly involving their beliefs and political affiliation, and then directing that they be killed. The executions were carried out immediately, with prisoners being marched directly from the place where their sham trial was held to the gallows. Some were hanged in a way that assured that they would die by strangulation rather than by breaking a spinal cord, and others were executed, as you've heard, by firing squad. Now, many of these facts were made known as early as the fall of 1988 to a Salvadoran professor and diplomat named Reynaldo Pol, who had been appointed as a special rapporteur and reported to the General Assembly of the United Nations about the execution of some 200 prisoners at Evin Prison and the burial of more than 800 in mass graves outside Tehran. But this report was not followed up either by Pol or by those at the UN. In 2009, the Iranian Human Rights Documentation Center, that's associated with Yale University, published a more comprehensive account under the title Deadly Fatwa, Iran's 1988 Prison Massacre. As you've heard, Jeffrey Robertson's comprehensive account was published, as I mentioned, in 2010. And this year, NCRI, which has sponsored this panel, has published its volume, Iran, Call for Justice, focusing particularly on the role of Ebrahim Raisi and on his case, and calling attention to some of his activities since 1988, including directing the killing of about 1,500 protesters in Iran during demonstrations that erupted in November of 2019. What then can be done to answer this call for justice? Before what tribunal can Raisi be brought to answer for his crimes? Now, I suppose before we consider that question, we should respond to the objections that some have raised to considering such a step on the ground that threatening prosecution, either civil or criminal, of those in power in Iran will only make them less inclined to give up power voluntarily. I think anyone who believes that any senior member of the current regime would even consider giving up power voluntarily, given the fanatical ideology of the regime, the enormous wealth that they've amassed, and their bloody record, is simply delusional. When they go down, it won't be voluntary. Perhaps the most convincing evidence of this is the very selection today and the installation today of Raisi as president. What it shows is that the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and those who follow his orders have no regard whatever for appearances. They put in place someone they believe, and I think correctly, can be relied on to use any measures, however brutal, to keep the regime in power. I think we are all aware that there is no readily available tribunal now sitting for the purpose of trying Raisi in person for his criminal behavior. There are issues with respect to the International Criminal Court, to which Mr. Robertson alluded, and the United States has not associated itself with the International Criminal Court. But since the judgment rendered in 1946 in Nuremberg against Germans convicted of crimes against humanity, among others, there have been special tribunals convened to try violations of law, such as those participated in by Raisi. Now, obviously, as Jeffrey Robertson pointed out, you need to have somebody in custody for that. These have included the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. To be sure, convening such a tribunal or referring this matter to the International Criminal Court would require issuance of a mandate by the UN Security Council. And as was anticipated by Mr. Robertson, we can readily anticipate that any attempt to pass such a measure in the Security Council would encounter possible veto, either by Russia or by China or both. But that's hardly an excuse for not trying. At a minimum, gathering evidence and placing it on the record in an attempt to get such a tribunal would put the nations in the Security Council on the spot. As well, we can rely for civil penalties on the Magnitsky Act and similar statutes, which would impede the ability of Raisi to function. Such an effort would serve at least two further useful purposes. One directly associated with the ultimate fate of Raisi, and the other somewhat more indirect. Indirectly, creating a further public record of the crimes of the president of Iran would weaken the regime even further that put him in place, both internationally and within Iran. But further, it would seem that perhaps the most likely criminal tribunal, and I think in some ways the most fitting one, before which Raisi might ultimately be made to answer for his crimes, would be a tribunal convened by the Iranians themselves, following a change in regime that I think all of those participating in this meeting would welcome. The best way to speed that day is to keep assembling and publicizing the evidence that showed what Raisi and others in the government have done. However, any such tribunal must proceed strictly on the basis of carefully vetted evidence. The time to assemble that evidence is now. Some of these events are 30 years or more in the past. We should not be deprived of reliable accounts of these events due to the passage of time. I think continuing to assemble and publicize the evidence will also hasten the day when it can be used. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Judge, for your thorough remarks. Certainly, you made some very important points that basically there is absolutely no excuse whatsoever that not to pursue the case of bringing Ebrahim Raisi to justice, setting up the file, the documentation, and pursuing various paths forward, both in terms of the legal aspect of things, but most importantly, politically speaking, putting the regime on notice, sending a strong signal to the victims of some 30,000 political prisoners who were killed in 1988 and the 1,500 who were killed in November 2019 during the uprising, and all the other repressive measures that this regime has done. You need to have the world community standing up on the side of the people, as you correctly said. And the worst thing to do is what the EU did just today, sending a representative to attend the swearing-in ceremony of this mass murderer, Ebrahim Raisi. And this will make a mockery of any talk about human rights, about any principles whatsoever, when the EU, which they didn't have to do it, they sent their representative to attend that event, which was actually a no event. There was really nothing happening during that swearing-in ceremony in the regime's parliament. It was just like a show similar to other shows that it just made the EU look bad by sending their own representatives to this. It should definitely be condemned, as we did, by everyone. This is absolutely not acceptable in any way and shape and form to give any sort of legitimacy to a regime who now has a mass murderer at the helm, whose judiciary chief is also involved in those killings. And then the supreme leader himself has been overseeing all of these activities, but also hiding the evidence and justifying things. But is the one who is institutionalizing the impunity, which Mr. Robertson made a reference to. So I really appreciate that, Judge. Now we'd like to go to Senator Lieberman, our next panel member. Senator, Washington needs to make a decision as what to do with a mass murder at the helm in Tehran, and they have a lot of issues on their table. But here's this 600-pound gorilla in the room walking in. That's Ebrahim Raisi, mass murderer. What do you think about that? What are your suggestions to the administration to really adopt an effective policy? What are your suggestions for your former colleagues in the U.S. Congress and elsewhere? We'd love to hear from you, Senator. Please.
Thanks, Ali Reza. It's a great honor to be here with you, with Judge Mukasey, and of course with Barrister Robertson. I want to begin with a quote from Winston Churchill. It's always a good idea to quote Churchill, but in the presence of a distinguished British barrister like Mr. Robertson, it's almost obligatory. Churchill said once that the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to go. And I agree with that. And so I want to begin this morning by looking backward to 1979, the year in which the Islamic Republic of Iran seized control of this great nation and made its citizens into political and economic slaves. The new government in Tehran began ominously, as we remember, for the United States when a mob kidnapped 52 American diplomats and held them hostage for 444 days. That was only the beginning. Looking backward, it is clear that the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was a major turning point for the worst in world history. It ushered in the various radical Islamist terrorist movements that have caused so much death of so many Americans and most of all of so many Muslims since then. The US Department of State, as we know, has consistently concluded that the Islamic Republic of Iran is the most significant state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And that's not just Shia terror, it's Sunni terror as well. Hamas, Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, Houthis. These terrorist groups have in turn caused enormous suffering and death throughout the region, in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and in Saudi Arabia. During its 42 years in power, this evil and extreme regime in Tehran has spent enormous amounts of the treasure that belongs to the Iranian people supporting foreign terrorists and building a nuclear weapons program and sophisticated missiles that can carry those weapons to the designated enemies of the current regime. And those enemies are in the Arab world, in Israel, and yes, in the United States of America. Within Iran itself, this regime has imposed one of the most brutally despotic governments in the world, taking from its talented people the political and economic freedom that really is their birthright. No single act, in my opinion, defined the regime in Tehran more clearly and tragically and painfully than the murder of as many as 30,000 people in Iran, Iranian citizens, for only one reason, that they were political opponents of the regime. In the 42 years since 1979, the regime in Tehran has brought to political power an awful group of leaders, of presidents, some claiming to be moderates, but really not, all following the extremist directions of the two men who in that time have been supreme leaders. Today, by far the worst ever to serve as president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, is being sworn in as president. And I don't say that lightly. I suppose looking back at history, many people would say, well, what about Ahmadinejad? Well, Ahmadinejad was an extremist. He was a fanatic. He said outrageous and offensive things, but Raisi comes to this high office of this country with such a great history, with the blood of more Iranians on his hands than any of his predecessors, probably than most of his predecessors combined. If the United States and the world do not act to bring this criminal mass murderer to justice today, August 5th, 2021, will live in ignominy, like the day, for instance, that the communists took power in Russia and started to build the Soviet Union, or the day that the Nazis took control of Germany. Raisi rejects and offends the values of opportunity, equality, justice, which are the basis of the American system of government, expressed so movingly in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The contrast between the kind of government and disdain and corruption for law that Raisi represents and what exists in the United States of America could not be more primal or stark. The reality is that these two systems cannot coexist in the same world. And it's clear which one has to go. It's the regime in Tehran and Ebrahim Raisi, the mass murderer. He is brazen. He's a lawyer and a jurist, Raisi, but he's consistently violated the law and corrupted globally accepted norms of justice. He is unapologetic in response to charges that he led the death commissions of 1988 that resulted in the death of thousands of his fellow Iranians. He does not deny his involvement. That's why the case against him, to make that case won't be difficult. He acknowledges what to us is guilt, but he proudly defends it. Here are Raisi's words. "It is my honor that I fought against hypocrisy." Can you believe that? Raisi justifies the genocide of thousands of Iranians simply because of their political opinions as a response to hypocrisy. It's unbelievable, but we must hear his words clearly and believe them because Raisi believes them. And that's why he must be brought to justice for the crimes against humanity he has committed before he settles in as Iran's president and, as widely expected, even becomes the third supreme leader of Iran. Raisi's presidency must therefore, does therefore threaten the Iranian people most of all, but it will also destabilize the entire Middle East and threaten the security of the United States and our closest allies in the region, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. Now, Judge Mukasey and Barrister Robertson have spoken of the difficulty of actually bringing Raisi before a tribunal in The Hague, for instance, to try him for crimes against humanity, which he has admitted and would surely be found guilty of. But that's not an excuse for not taking action. And I think that suggests the political course of action, political in the best sense of a rising up of public opinion, beginning here in the United States, beginning today at this gathering sponsored by the NCRI to focus the world's attention on Raisi's crimes. Totalitarian governments, as we know, thrive in the darkness. And there is no question that that the regime in Tehran believed for years that this genocide that occurred 33 years ago was long forgotten by the rest of the world. In fact, there was only one group and one person that constantly was calling out for Raisi to be held accountable for the genocide he oversaw in 1988. And of course, the organization was the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and the leader was Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. It's really quite encouraging to say that Mrs. Rajavi and the NCRI's constant returning to the facts here, the remarkable report that Barrister Robertson did, the concern expressed by many at the United Nations, the persistent voice being brought here by non-governmental organizations that are widely respected, like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, all of whom are saying this man, Raisi, cannot be allowed to lead a great nation, even one now that is held hostage by a terrible government. So this is an opportunity to shine the light on Raisi's crimes, and also to make clear that he's not an accidental president. He was chosen by the supreme leader, thinking he could get away with this choice, notwithstanding the blood on Raisi's hands, or are not caring what the rest of the world thought. And that simply has to be unacceptable to the rest of the world. Here in the United States, I think we have a critical leadership role to play, thanks to the grassroots work of the Iranian American communities and the representatives of the NCRI in Washington. There is a great stirring in both houses of Congress. In the House of Representatives, 250 members of both parties have signed a resolution calling for an investigation of Raisi's human rights violations and genocidal acts. In the Senate, the support for a similar action is building, led by Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who's the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and supported by Senator Jim Risch, his Republican ranking member. The critical decision to be made here will be by President Biden and, of course, Secretary Blinken. And President Biden, during his campaign and since he's been president, has made very clear that he wants to restore human rights and democracy promotion to the center of American foreign policy. And the truth is that over our history, we have always been in our strongest when we've been the most faithful to our founding ideals of human rights and democracy. And in recent, and I know that the administration has seemed to want very much to renegotiate and have another agreement of the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA of 2015. But really, how can the Biden administration be consistent with its upholding of human rights and democracy in our foreign policy if it continues to negotiate with a government that is led now by Raisi, a man who is guilty of genocidal acts and who has been a serial human rights oppressor? The administration will lose its credibility. And so I call on them to step back and think about what Raisi's election as president says about the regime in Tehran and what it should say to the Biden administration about the possibility of achieving a reasonable agreement in the negotiations in Vienna. The truth is that any agreement that can possibly be reached with a country led by Raisi will be worth no more than the piece of paper that Neville Chamberlain waved around when he returned from Munich, saying that that agreement with Hitler would bring peace in their time. Of course, what it did was lead to the Second World War. And the same kind of devastation can occur if the Biden administration and the other members of the P5 won't allow themselves to go forward to the negotiations, with Iran in Vienna. The reality is that this regime needs to be changed. We have tried everything else we could, and this selection by the supreme leader of Raisi as president is the ultimate rejection of the values of the world community and certainly of the United States. My friends, as I said at the outset, I wanted to look backward so we can look forward. And now really is the time to look forward and to act. The campaign to bring Raisi to justice, to hold him accountable, begins today at this meeting, and I think will spread throughout the world. Today, the day on which the man most responsible for the genocide of 1988 becomes president of Iran, if the US leads, will also be noted in history as the day on which the world began to hold Raisi and the regime accountable, when we began to investigate him and the regime and to bring him and it to justice for the crimes they have committed, to see him removed from the presidency, and most significantly of all, to see this government removed from power in Tehran, so that the people of Iran, the gifted people of Iran, can again choose their own leaders and enjoy the political and economic freedom and opportunity that is their birthright. I have no doubt that if men and women of goodwill in the US and throughout the world join this cause, which reflects universal values of human rights, the time for Raisi and the regime to stay in power in Tehran is limited. May that be so with your help and with God's help. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator Lieberman, because of your absolutely great remarks. And you said that today, this day, which is supposedly marked the day that Raisi takes office, we should make this day the day to hold him accountable for his crimes against humanity, and bring him the day to start not his presidency, but to start another level of campaign to bring him to justice before international tribunals. As you know, Mrs. Rajavi has repeatedly over the years led this campaign for accountability. She re-emphasized on this call in the July 3-day free run 2021 event. And now we have the opportunity to really take it to the next level now that the target is very clear, you know, as the new president of the regime. And there is also enough grounds, evidence, but also momentum, as you mentioned, that has been built in favor of this. You have a very strong bipartisan voice of the US Congress, both in the House and the Senate. Senator Bob Menendez, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was very clear in his message on July 10th that you know, the issue of the investigation of Raisi's role should be basically a priority, but also human rights organizations, 7 UN special rapporteurs, and all of that. That's extremely important. And you know, one question was actually posed to me, and I'm going to go to the panel, that, you know, what do I mean when I said the conflict between the regime and the people have gotten into a new level between the MEK and the regime? Well, I think just think about it. Back in 1988, the very top of the regime, the number 2 person, Ayatollah Montazeri, was dismissed of his position. It was a very, very crucial rift on top of the regime because of the MEK. He protested the annihilation of the MEK at the time, and that cost him his successorship. And he fought both against Khomeini, who is dead, but also the death commission, including Raisi. Now, 33 years later, this regime has chosen, after they dismissed Montazeri because of the MEK, 33 years later, this leader has chosen Raisi to be at the helm because of the MEK, because he has this track record and history of killing some 30,000 political prisoners, most of them, 90% of them, members of the MEK, but he has no mercy whatsoever, and he will use his repressive policies to counter the protests. But I think the evidence shows that's too little, too late. It's not going to help the regime. But let me pose the questions to the members of the panel. First, I want to go to Mr. Robertson, and I want this question to be answered by all the other two panel members as well, because I saw the Amnesty International today criticize the EU for sending a senior diplomat to to attend the Raisi's inauguration. The Enrique Mora, and then what's your reaction? What do you think? What do you think about this, and what do you think others should do about this? Mr. Robertson, please.
Well, the EU has last year signed up to the Magnitsky laws, and so we do expect it's been putting targeted sanctions on Belarus, and we do expect rather better. Unfortunately, the foreign minister for the EU, a fellow called Barroso, is a pretty stupid Spanish trade unionist who's got up in the politics of the EU. He's already blotted his copybook by seeming to Duchess Russia, going to stroke Mr. Putin. And when he was caught, his first press conference, he was asked what he thought of the Magnitsky law, and he never heard of it. So that's how ignorant he is. And I would see this attendance at the inauguration of a man who is a cold-blooded killer shows that the EU has a little way to go in getting its human rights aspirations in coordination with its human rights policy. But I nonetheless believe that this is a good way to go. I see, and I've written a book on the subject, I see Magnitsky laws, which were the creation of the US, now that they've been adopted by 31 democratic countries, and Japan and Australia have got laws, Magnitsky laws in the making. I see this as a way forward in the defense of democracy against authoritarian states. And the way to bring these countries together is certainly the elevation of this international criminal to state power, and the terrifying prospect that he'll be developing a nuclear weapon. So I think that this is a way for American diplomacy to work for a better world, so that Raisi may eventually be a blessing in disguise. Obviously, it's important, as Judge Mukasey says, to get an authoritative version, and so an inquiry is another way forward.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robertson. Judge Mukasey, your thoughts on the EU representative visit to Tehran, and as Mr. Robertson said, that they didn't know about the Magnitsky law, but they did know about Raisi and rushing to Tehran to give legitimacy to a mass murder. Judge Mukasey, your thoughts, please.
Well, it's very refreshing to hear Mr. Robertson's exquisite summary of Mr. Barroso's level of intelligence and achievement. I can't possibly top that. I think that it's quite clear that the EU has chosen somebody as its foreign minister, if that's what he is, who has no knowledge of what it is the EU supposedly stands for. I don't think we should rely on the EU. The United States should press forward, rallying other democracies who have passed, as Mr. Robertson pointed out, Magnitsky Acts of their own, implement the Magnitsky Act, make it difficult for Raisi and other members of the regime to travel, to function economically, which is very important to them because they've enriched themselves at the expense of the Iranian people, to continue to make it difficult for them and to continue to undermine their credibility. And as far as this act by the foreign minister of the EU, it is a disgrace, and I think should be pointed out as a disgrace. And I think our Secretary of State ought to abandon some of the diplomatic niceties and call it out for what it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge. Senator Lieberman, your thoughts?
Yeah, I could be brief because I agree with my two colleagues. It strikes me that picking up on the last thought of Judge Mukasey, that about Secretary Blinken making a comment, I think, having heard Mr. Robertson's description of the gentleman from Spain, that perhaps Robertson could draft a statement for Blinken about Raisi. Look, the fact that the EU sent a representative to Raisi's inauguration is truly disheartening. And it clearly does not represent the values of the European Union, or if I may more broadly say, of Western civilization. It is really putting form over substance. In other words, it's a kind of reflex reaction. A new president is being sworn in Iran. Of course, the European Union will send somebody to participate, but this is not just another president. This is not Ahmadinejad, as extreme and in some ways crazy as he was. This is a murderer. And by going there, this representative seems to say that the European Union accepts the awful record of Raisi. And I hope there'll be a second look at that, and beginning with the European Union. But I also agree with Mike Mukasey that our administration here in Washington really should speak out and condemn Raisi, because he represents everything that is unacceptable to the United States of America. And our silence really brings us down to his level. And that's nowhere where any of us want to be.
Thank you so much, Senator Lieberman. Actually, speaking of the Magnitsky Act, I want to remind everyone that earlier this year, in February of 2021, Senator Ben Cardin, Democrat from Maryland, and Senator Roger Wicker, Republican, they introduced the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Authorization Act that would eventually, give the authority to the United States to do the right thing when it comes to these issues that we discussed today. So there is a bipartisan support for this issue, both in the Senate, both chambers in the Senate and the House. And I think we need to really, as all of you mentioned, we need to build a case, both politically, but also legally. All of the efforts that have been done was unthinkable a few years ago. And, Mr. Roberts, I want to ask you one very quick question. When you started your investigations over a decade ago, and did you think that eventually, especially with the experience you had with the special representative of UN on Iran that basically dropped the ball, did you expect that we will get to a point that now 7 UN representatives, 7 UN rapporteurs, a whole host of human rights organizations, US Congress, and everybody else would echo this call that we've been calling for a long time. But it's one thing, the voice coming from the Iranian opposition, the victims, but it's another thing for everybody else to line up their vectors. And did you think that we will be able to get to the point where we are now? And of course, by extension, we can get to really to the final goal.
Well, I was flabbergasted by the level of this atrocity. No one had heard of it. And when these two were wonderful daughters of Mr. Boromond, who had been assassinated by the order of the Ayatollah years before, it came to me, I didn't expect to find the level of atrocity that I did. And you must remember that although I like to think my report was authoritative, I had only about 45 very nervous witnesses. And I think it would, and there were some questions I didn't get to the bottom of. There is some evidence that the killing of the MEK was predetermined, that it didn't just emanate from the rage of the Ayatollah, but there is scope for a more authoritative report. And I think it has remarkable in a way that this has gone from something no one knew about to something that is now on the international agenda and is understood. But the more authoritative report we can get in, the better, because we do have a head of state who is in effect a cold-blooded killer and who will have access to nuclear technology. And if there is no agreement in Vienna, will, as I wrote a book called Mullahs Without Mercy, which sets out the case against the Khomeini state and takes it forward to 2009 when hundreds of protesters were killed, but also looks back on right back to the Shah who wanted the bomb. And so that is part of Iranian thinking. And I'm sure that if Vienna fails under Raisi, they will go for it. So the question needs even more elaboration, and the world has to be made aware of what is at stake with this man and his colleagues. The Magnitsky movement must encompass his colleagues, his supporters, his apparatchiks, and must not ignore the current supreme leader, who was president in 1988 and who encouraged the death squads, so the death committees. So he, of all people, has
Okay, I think we lost the voice of Mr. Robertson.
Yeah, I seem to run out of juice, but I was ended anyway as saying the current supreme leader has a case to answer as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Robertson. I want to get the last words from Judge Mukasey and then later from Senator Lieberman. Judge, any other closing thoughts?
Well, I take a somewhat less optimistic view of the possible effect, even of an agreement with the Iranians. The proof of that is that they continued to have an ICBM, a guided missile program. There is a ballistic missile program. There is no country in the world that has a ballistic missile program that does not also have a nuclear weapons program. None, zero. And so there is eloquent proof that they intend, regardless of any agreement, to pursue a nuclear weapon. And that simply makes more acute the need to remove them from power and to call attention to their record and to weaken them internationally and within the country.
Yes, thank you so much, Judge. Appreciate that. And Senator Lieberman, please.
Thanks, Ali Reza. Look, I think this has been a very good discussion, and a lot of good information came out. Part of it about how much progress we have made since the NCRI and Mrs. Rajabi were really alone in trying to hold Raisi accountable for his brutal genocidal acts. So as we've all said today, the path to bring him literally to justice now is not a clear one. But we are now making progress in informing the rest of the world about how outrageous it is. Not just that Raisi has become, this mass murderer has become the president of Iran, but that the supreme leader and presumably the entire leadership group has chosen him to do that with all, as I said repeatedly, of the Iranian blood he has on his hands. So I think that the argument ahead is political in the best sense of that term. And basically for us to say to our administration here in Washington and for people throughout the world to say to their governments, how can we possibly continue to deal with a country led by a mass murderer? What do we how can we think that we can trust an agreement on nuclear weapons to a country led by a man who has made light of his role, accepted it, acknowledged it, and made light of his role in bringing about the death of 30,000 people only because he didn't like their political opinions. So this all leads to what I would call a diplomatic political rejection of the current government in Iran and a call for regime change. I just leave you with this question. How could we possibly want this man who has shown his willingness to kill thousands of people to be the leader of a nation that may one day soon have nuclear weapons? The world and each of us and our families, our children, grandchildren will be profoundly unsafe if that happens. And we've got to stop it now before the peace of the world is truly threatened. So Ali Reza, thank you for a very thoughtful, really thoughtful and responsible discussion. We've got a lot of work to do from here, but the path has been set. As Churchill said, we've looked backward and it's going to help us go forward in a way that the world needs right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Lieberman. Really appreciate the thoughts. And, each of you had very, very important points that you raised. And, Mr. Robertson mentioned just now that this whole massacre was a premeditated work that was intended to eliminate the MEK. Certainly this is something that Montazeri, the designate, said that a few years before that, he was told by Khomeini's son, Ahmad, that was the plan. With that, I want to give myself the liberty to really wrap up and end the discussion and draw some conclusions based on the discussion that all of the panel members have had. First of all, I think the most important thing was that you all mentioned that the culture of impunity for the mass murderers who rule Iran must end, and U.S. must take the lead in bringing to justice the leaders of the regime who have committed crimes against humanity for 4 decades, particularly those responsible for the 1988 massacre. Khamenei, Raisi, and AJI, the new Chief Justice, basically topped the list of those who need to be brought to justice. Second, we really need to subject the Iranian regime to international sanctions under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. As we saw over the past year, the mullahs will never give up their nuclear weapons program, export of terrorism, or aggression in the region. So that's what needs to be done. And most importantly, we really need to implement a zero tolerance policy, if you will, regarding the torture and execution of the Iranian people, the killing of the dissidents. The perpetrators really must be made to answer for their crimes, and you discuss a lot of the ways that could be done. And also when it comes to the broader threat of the Iran regime in terms of bomb making, enrichment, and all of their nuclear facilities, they really need to be closed. Any agreement that doesn't oblige the regime to withdraw the Revolutionary Guards from Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Lebanon, you name it, it's going to be ineffective. It's going to be reckless. It's not going to have any results. And any agreement that doesn't target the missile program of the regime to halt, as Judge Mukasey said, will really lead to the escalation of the regional threat. And the 4 decades of terrorism and hostage taking by the regime, they need to be held to account for that as well. That's the other side of their human rights violations, and we shouldn't be rewarding the Ayatollahs with more concessions. And finally, because the final outcome the good outcome will come when the Ayatollahs are gone. So really, the world has a duty and responsibility to stand on the side of the Iranian people and recognize their struggle to overthrow this regime and establish freedom and democracy, and help them develop a secular, democratic, non-nuclear republic, Iran. So with that, I want to really thank all of the panel members for your very valuable discussions and thoughts. And as Senator Lieberman said, we should use this day as the day to launch a new level of accountability. I want to thank Mr. Jeffrey Robertson. I want to thank Judge Mukasey. I want to thank Senator Lieberman, as well as our audience who've been watching this all over the country on Zoom. And until the next program, goodbye, and God bless all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.